So, what do we do when a document signer doesn't have an acceptable form of identification? What do we tell the client? What happens if the client really needs to have a signature notarized, but they lost a wallet or their purse was stolen and the person can't obtain identification quick enough for a time sensitive document, such as a loan signing document? After all, if the type of identification document somebody wants to use is not listed here, then it's not acceptable. Well, fortunately, there's a way around this very difficult situation, and it's called using credible witnesses. As long as the notary has no reason or information to believe that the signer is not who he or she claims to be, the notary may rely on the oath of another individual who does have acceptable identification and who personally knows the document signer. Now, this person is called a credible witness, and California notary law says that this credible witness must also personally know the notary public. Now, you can imagine it may be quite difficult to find someone who personally knows the notary and personally knows the document signer. Well, there's a way around that as well. If someone cannot be found who personally knows both the document signer and the notary, then two people, both of whom are unknown by the notary public, but of course know the document signer, may swear an oath to the notary on behalf of the identity of the document signer and become credible witnesses for the identification of that document signer. Of course, both credible witnesses must personally know the document signer. Now, as a part of the notary process, you'll discover that the notary must require an oath from the credible witnesses that he or she does indeed personally know the document signer. It's, after all, through the oath of the credible witnesses that we're going to identify that document signer. And the oath of the credible witness or witnesses are only used because the document signer does not have and cannot obtain an acceptable identification document. Now, you might be thinking at this point, so I can use the oaths of another person or two other people in case one other person doesn't know the notary personally? What in the world are you talking about? And besides, I thought that personal knowledge was not allowed to be used. Okay, let me back up just for a second. When someone needs to have a signature notarized, the first step for identification is to use an identification document. Even if the notary personally knows the document signer, for example, a boss or fellow employee, the signer must still present proper identification to the notary. Personal knowledge between the notary and the document signer are not acceptable. But if the document signer doesn't have an acceptable identification document, and there's no reasonable way to get that identification document, the notary may use the oath of other people who do know the document signer as long as they have their own identification documents. The notary may use the oath of one person if that person also personally knows the notary public, or may use the oaths of two people in the event that neither of them is personally known by the notary public. So we see here in our example that Notary Nick, the guy in the center, has been requested to notarize a signature for signer Sandra, who's unable to present identification. Let's say Sandra just recently got married and her identification is still in her maiden name, so she does not have an acceptable form of identification. So Notary Nick is going to need to use the credible witness method to identify signer Sandra. All right, signer Sandra is a co-worker with credible Carl and asks him to swear an oath to the notary on her behalf regarding her identification. Now, it turns out that credible Carl and Notary Nick happen to also be longtime acquaintances. So since credible Carl knows Notary Nick personally and Notary Nick knows credible Carl personally, Notary Nick can go ahead and use Carl as that credible witness. But when there is no one who personally knows both the document signer and the notary public who could be used as credible witnesses, we're then forced to use two credible witnesses as long as both credible witnesses personally know and are willing to vouch for the identity of the document signer. Clearly, credible witnesses must always know the document signer, or we could not use them as credible witnesses. That should make perfect sense. Well, what constitutes this idea of personal knowledge anyway? Personally known is not really defined in California law, but it's interpreted for notarial purposes in California to have an acquaintance with a person that establishes the person's identity with at least reasonable certainty. An acquaintance substantial enough to establish personal knowledge includes multiple and recent meetings with the person, including meetings during which a person is identified by the people, a chain of circumstances that would lead a reasonable person to believe an acquaintance is who they say they are, forms the basis for personal knowledge. For example, coworkers have a personal knowledge of each other if they meet frequently at their workplace, and colleagues and customers have identified them in the presence of others. Personal knowledge isn't likely for a very short time social acquaintance meetings or see one another very infrequently. It's not up to the notary to establish personal knowledge between the credible witnesses and the document signer, as long as the notary has no reason to know otherwise. Keep in mind that when a single credible witness is used, even though the notary public personally knows that credible witness, the notary public must still confirm the credible witness's identity by examining his or her paper identification documents. After the notary public has established the identity of the credible witness or witnesses, the notary must administer an oath or affirmation to the credible witness. It's on the basis of this oath or affirmation that the identity of the document signer is established. Under oath or affirmation and under penalty of perjury, both credible witnesses must swear or affirm that each of the following statements is true. The individual appearing before the notary public as the signer of the document is the person named within the document. The credible witness personally knows the signer. The credible witness reasonably believes that the circumstances of the signer are such that it would be very difficult or impossible for the signer to obtain another form of identification. That the signer does not possess any of the identification documents authorized by law to establish the signer's identity. And the credible witness does not have a financial interest in the document and is not named in the document.